By the seventh day the meat had turned. What began as a proud haul, red, rich cuts from a clean kill near the river bend, now reeked of wet fur and sour death. The smell clung to his hands, no matter how deep he scrubbed in snow. He'd wrapped it tightly, buried it in shade, even smoked part of it by the evening fire. But none of it lasted. Now the fat had soured, the sinew gone soft. Worse than waste, it was insult. Kemme stood by the edge of the lake, holding the last strip of ruined meat. He could still feel the arrow leave his bow, still see the deer drop cleanly near the spruce. That moment had felt right, sacred. But now, holding rot in his palm, it felt like the animal had died for nothing. His mother had warned him about spring thaws. The air turns before the land does, she'd said. What hides in snow may wake in meat. But he had been so sure, so proud, and now empty stomachs were asking questions. The elders wouldn't scold him, not directly, but their silence had weight. One hunter even offered him dried rabbit with a crooked smile. Just in case your next kill disappears too. That night, Kemme didn't eat. Instead, he sat beside the dying fire, staring into the coals and thinking about how quickly the world spoils what's not protected. The land was changing. Winters were shorter. Warm spells came without warning. What had worked for his grandfather's time didn't hold anymore. And still, somewhere in memory, something stirred. An old story. Half a sentence. A method used by the river people, far to the north, something about cold water and still air. He couldn't recall if it was real or legend, but it stuck to him like the scent of rot in his coat. The next morning, Kemme rose before the sun, wrapped in furs stiff with frost. He carried fresh cuts from a new kill, smaller this time, cleaner. He walked to where the lake still wore its edge of winter, where the ice hadn't fully surrendered. He cracked a thin sheet with the head of his spear and felt the sting of water below so cold it numbed the ache in his bones. Then he lowered the meat in, not to soak, to store. He built no fire, spoke no words. He only waited, watched, and trusted that the lake might remember the wisdom he had forgotten. The water clutched the meat like a frozen hand, not stiff but still, not biting but constant. Kemme watched it sink, tethered by a loop of sinew tied to a branch, disappearing just below the shimmering pane where ice met water. It hovered there, suspended in the stillness, like it belonged more to the cold than to the living. He marked the spot with birch bark and packed snow around the edges. Then he stepped back, unsure whether he'd buried a solution or just wasted more food. For 2 days he returned at dawn and again before nightfall. The lake said nothing. It only breathed through cracks in its armor, thin curls of mist rising when the sun reached across it. On the third morning, Kemme pulled one of the smaller cuts from the water. It was cold to the core, firm as stone, yet not frozen solid. No stench, no slime, no surrender. He cut it open with his flint, the color inside still dark, still rich, still promising. That night, he roasted it lightly on a stone near the low fire. He didn't want it to cook through just warm enough to speak. He took one bite, then another. It tasted like the day it was taken, not aged, not spoiled, preserved. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the realization that this was no accident. The water had cradled the meat like a root cellar's the last harvest, not freezing, not festering, just holding. When the others tasted it, they asked no questions, only took second helpings. Even the hunter who had mocked him before now chewed slowly, then glanced at Kemme with narrowed eyes. "Where?" he asked. "You kept this where?" Kemme pointed to the lake. "In the water?" the man scoffed. "Beneath the ice," Kemme replied, "where the sun cannot lie." That night, 3 others followed him to the lake's edge. He showed them how to carve just deep enough, how to tie sinew to stone for weight, how to angle the meat so it wouldn't drift or freeze, how to seal the opening again with snow and bark, how to let the earth do what heat could not protect without changing. And slowly the whispers began. That Kemme had found a new way, that the water was his ally, that his meat stayed red while theirs turned gray. But he didn't boast. He just returned each day, checking his bundle, watching how long the flesh could last. Not a trick, not a spell. Just cold water, still air, and respect. And beneath the ice it waited, fresh, untouched, as if the kill had only just happened. It was the 7th morning when he saw it, a thread of steam rising from the lake's surface, thin as a ghost's breath. The ice had begun to thin along the southern edge, curling away from the snowpack like a peeled bark. Kemi crouched low, eyes narrowed. The air was changing, subtle but certain. Spring. Too soon. The others hadn't noticed yet. They were busy smoking trout, sealing deer sinew, sharpening tools for the new season. But Kemi felt it in his chest, that quiet panic a hunter feels when the wind shifts mid-stalk. The cold had kept his secret safe, but now the world was warming. He waded into the slush before the others rose. His boots broke the crust and soaked with lake water, but he didn't care. He reached into the cold and pulled up his first bundle. Still chilled, still safe, but not for long. If the water warmed just a few degrees, it wouldn't preserve anymore. It would awaken things meant to stay asleep. He dried the meat with cedar leaves and laid it on ice-cooled stones beside his lodge. Then, without speaking, he walked from shelter to shelter and knocked softly. "The cold is leaving," he said. "We must take what we've hidden and use it now." Some listened, others shrugged. One woman asked, "Did the lake tell you this?" Kemi nodded. "Not with words, with steam." He showed her the edge, the cracks, the breath in the air that no longer bit. She touched the surface, watched the mist rise, and said no more. By dusk, several had pulled their bundles, drying meat near the coals or slicing it thin for fireless chewing. A few ignored the warning, claiming their meat was too deep in the lake to warm. But by the second day, one man's bundle floated back to the surface, the sinew untied, the meat gray and soft as moss. His lodge reeked of regret. Kemi helped him burn it, not out of shame, but to keep the sickness from spreading. He remembered his mother's old lesson: the sun gives, then it spoils. Know the moment between. That moment was now. He adjusted the storage method, using deeper sections, anchoring with stone, even shading the opening with pine boughs to keep the lake's memory of winter just a little longer. But he knew it wouldn't last. No trick lasts forever. Nature always reclaims the balance. And so he began drying what he couldn't hide, sharing what he couldn't store, feeding those who had trusted too long in the stillness. Because the secret hadn't been the water. It had been the timing. And steam was the first breath of warning. His name was Sagan Lean, fast, proud, a hunter with quick eyes and quicker opinions. When Kemi first buried his meat beneath the lake, Sagan laughed so loud he spooked the elk on the western ridge. "Why not hang it from the clouds?" he'd joked. "Or teach it to fly?" He used smoke, fire, salt when he had it. The old ways, the loud ways. But now the thaw had begun, and Sagan's racks of smoked venison dripped fat onto wet dirt. The warmer air turned sweetness to stink. The once sharp edges of his confidence began to dull. And by the time he wandered past Kemi's lodge again, his eyes didn't mock. "You still have yours?" he asked. Kemi nodded. Sagan shifted, pretending not to care. "Some of mine turned, just a little." Kemi didn't answer. He knew just a little meant enough to bring sickness if eaten, and shame if admitted. "Maybe," Sagan said, voice low, "you could show me, just to see." Kemi stood. Not with pride, with understanding. They walked to the lake's edge, where the ice still lingered thick in shadow. Kemi showed him the markers, how he used birch bark to track his bundles, how he buried the meat at just the right depth, how the stones anchored, the sinew held, the cold did the rest. Sagan crouched, studying it all. "I should have listened," he muttered. "You weren't ready," Kemi said. "Now you are." They pulled one bundle from the depths. Sagan sliced into it and blinked. The meat was perfect. Cold to the bone, red and rich. He brought it to his nose and inhaled. "No rot," he whispered. "No fire," Kemi replied. That night, Sagan didn't boast. He stayed by the lake, carving storage bundles from cedar bark, tying them in silence. His pride didn't vanish, it simply bent, like a tree in strong wind. By the next morning, others who had once mocked Kemi began to follow. They came with questions, with sinew, with meat that still held hope. Kemi showed them what he could, but always reminded them of one thing: the water gives only while it's cold. Once it remembers the sun, it returns to hunger. Some understood. some didn't. But Sagan did. He now visited the lake at dawn, whispering thanks before dipping each cut. And when a younger boy asked him if it was magic, he said, "No, it's just knowing what cold remembers." Because in the land of shifting seasons, knowledge wasn't loud, it was quiet, buried, cold, and waiting to be shared. By mid-moon, the ice was fading faster than breath on hot stone. What was once a vault of frozen trust was now a mirror of betrayal. The water began to stir, no longer still, and with movement came danger. Kemi knew it was time to adapt again. One morning he watched steam rise from the lake like ghosts lifting away their secrets. The bundles he once trusted could not be left much longer, and so he asked himself a quiet question. How do you warm meat without losing it? Fire had always been the enemy of freshness. It transformed, it claimed. But what if fire could be reshaped not to cook, but to dry, to hold, to preserve without burning? That afternoon, Kemi built a new kind of frame, not tall like the smoking racks used for fish, but low and wide, woven with thin willow rods. He placed the meat across it, not above flames, but over warm stones that had been heated and then pulled from the fire's heart. No smoke, no crackling, just warmth that rose like breath from the earth. He covered the structure with hide, angled to let air move gently through while keeping sun and insects out. Inside, the meat grew, firmer, not cooked, not raw, dried, preserved. When Sagan visited and lifted one of the pieces, he furrowed his brow. "This won't rot?" "No," Kemi said, "because it never got hot enough to forget what it is." The process was slower than fire. It required patience, watching the heat, adjusting the hides, but it was safer, kinder. The meat lasted longer. It tasted like the forest wood, and wind and quiet time. Word spread. Others came to learn. Kemi taught them how to test stones for just the right warmth, warm enough to dry, never to cook. He showed them how to arrange the meat thin and flat, how to rotate without tearing, how to listen to the rhythm of drying flesh. It became more than a method, it became a ritual. One woman with 5 children thanked him, saying, "You've taught us how to keep winter even in spring." He only smiled. Because that's what it was, the memory of cold carried forward, not in fear, but in practice. No longer did they scramble at the first sign of thaw. They had a second path now, one shaped by stone, not smoke. And the fire, once feared for what it could take, was now trusted for what it could hold. Not by burning, but by breathing. The man came wrapped in furs, not from the region darker, heavier, lined with a kind of stitch Kemi had only seen once, long ago, on a trader from beyond the Great Pass. He arrived at sunset, without ceremony, his footsteps careful, his hands empty. But his eyes, they searched the air like a hunter tracking scent. He waited by the outer fire ring until the elders acknowledged him. "I followed the stories," he said. "From valley to valley, from mouth to mouth. They said there was a place where meat doesn't rot." Kemi, standing quietly behind the circle, knew the stories had traveled faster than he expected. It wasn't pride he felt, it was weight. "Who taught you this?" the stranger asked. Kemi stepped forward. "The cold, the wind, and the failure of my own hands." That earned a nod. The man produced a strip of meat from his satchel, wrapped in moss, tied with thin reed. He offered it to Kemi. "This is what we eat, salted hard. A mouthful takes minutes to chew, but it travels far." Kemi bit off a piece. It was strong, bitter, dry to the point of dust. Then he walked to his lodge, pulled a strip from his willow-dried stores, thinner, flexible, still rich with color. He offered it without word. The stranger chewed once, stopped, then again, then smiled. "This is alive," he said. "No fire touched it," Kemi replied. "Only breath, only time." They sat together by the coals as others gathered. Kemi explained his method, the submerged storage in winter, the low heat drying in spring, the shift from burning to preserving. The stranger asked precise questions. How deep to bury in water? What kind of hide to wrap? How often to turn the drying strips? He listened like someone who didn't just want to learn, but to protect. "I came because I thought it was a trick," the man said. "But this is no trick. This is memory." Kemi nodded. "The lake remembers winter. The stone remembers fire. All I did was listen. Before the man left, he knelt beside the drying frame, closed his eyes, and placed both palms on the warm stone beneath it. "May my people remember this too," he whispered. He departed with no gifts, only knowledge. And in the days that followed, more came not to trade goods, but to gather wisdom. The camp became known not for its warriors or its harvest, but for its quiet miracle, the meat that did not rot. And the man who had failed once, then listened deeply enough to change everything. The deer walked straight into the clearing, not panicked, not wounded, not chasing or chased, just walking, ears high, breath calm. A solitary buck with gray along its muzzle and a scar down its shoulder, like it had survived too many winters to care who watched. Keme stood frozen by the drying racks. Around him, the lodge was quiet, the children still sleeping, the smoke holes sealed. He stared at the animal. The animal stared back. It wasn't hunting season, the kill wasn't needed, the meat racks were full, but still, something passed between them, a thread pulled tight across time. Keme had seen this buck before. Not clearly, not up close, but in the outline of antlers beyond tree trunks, in tracks by the frozen creek, in the rustle of leaves too high for fawns. It had escaped him once. Maybe more than once. But here it was now, walking straight toward the place where meat hung, not to eat, but to see. Keme didn't reach for his bow. He didn't need to. The buck stopped near the edge of the racks, sniffed the air, and exhaled. Then it turned its head not in fear, but with the calm of something that recognized change. Keme whispered, "I've taken enough." And the buck walked on. Later that day, when he told the story, a few chuckled. "Maybe the deer came to thank you," one boy said. "For not wasting his brothers," another woman added. "Maybe he came to see how long his spirit could last." But Keme didn't offer an answer. He only looked toward the trees, toward the path the buck had vanished down. Because something was different now. The camp no longer hunted to fill, they hunted to honor. The racks never overflowed. The drying stones were used only when needed. The lake was no longer a hiding place, but a memory keeper. And that day, as the sun warmed the frames and the scent of curing meat floated through the village without drawing flies, Keme realized that the greatest preservation wasn't of food, it was of respect. For the animal, for the season, for the unseen line between hunger and greed. He took down a single strip of meat and placed it beside the lodge fire as an offering not to gods, not to spirits, but to the deer who had returned without fear. That night, no one ate it. But no one moved it either, because some food was not for the body, it was for remembering. It was a young boy named Panna who made the mistake, eager, proud, and only 10 winters into life. He had watched Keme countless times, mimicking his hand movements in the air, copying the knotting of sinew with twigs, even whispering to the stones as they warmed, just as he'd seen the older man do. But this time, he wanted to try it alone. He waited until dawn, slipped away from his mother's lodge, and carried 2 small cuts of rabbit meat in a bark wrap down to the lake's edge. The ice was long gone now. Spring had fully awakened, but the water was still cool, still tempting. Panna found a shady inlet, tied his bundle as best he could, and lowered it just beneath the surface. Then he covered it with moss and returned, thinking he had succeeded. 3 days later, the village smelled it. A sharp, bitter scent drifting across the breeze, faint, but wrong. Keme's nose caught it first. He followed the wind, circling the camp slowly until he came to the trees near the inlet. There, tucked beneath damp moss, he found the bundle soft, leaking, and swarming with the first wave of spring flies. He didn't speak. He simply lifted it carefully, wrapped it in fresh bark, and buried it deep in the fire pit beneath the stones, sealing the earth with sage. Later, Panna came forward on his own, eyes wet, shame thick in his throat. "I tried what you did," he said, voice shaking. "I wanted to be ready." Keme knelt beside him. "Do you know what went wrong?" Panna nodded. "The water was too warm. I didn't check, and I left it too long." Keme placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's how I learned too." The boy blinked. "You made mistakes? My first kill rotted in spring. I buried the failure, not the meat. It taught me everything." The elders didn't punish Panna. Instead, They made space for him beside the drying racks. Each morning he turned the strips with Keme. He watched the stones, checked the heat with the back of his hand, felt the air shift when storms whispered across the horizon. And slowly the boy's shame became skill. The mistake that had nearly spoiled the food became a moment remembered, a lesson passed down. Because in the world Keme was shaping, error was not weakness. It was instruction. And knowledge wasn't just what you learned from success. It was what you carried forward from failure, so the next fire, the next bundle, the next season wouldn't be lost. They arrived just after the rains, cloaks damp, brows furrowed, backs stiff with the weight of age and tradition. These were not the kind of elders who asked questions. They were the ones who gave answers, carved from years of fire and frost, of long hunts and longer winters. They had seen children born, wars ended, and rivers change course. But this time, they came not to instruct, but to watch. Keme greeted them with a quiet bow. He didn't speak until they settled near the fire ring, legs folded, hands clasped over worn knees. Only then did he motion to the willow frames, the warm stones, the thin cuts of meat hanging in gentle rows. One elder, eyes clouded but still sharp, spoke first. "We've seen many ways to keep food. We've buried it in snow, dried it in sun, salted it in trade. But yours lasts longer." Keme nodded. Another asked, "What do you call it?" "I don't," he replied. "The lake taught it. I just listened." They sat in silence for a while. The wind moved through the racks. The scent of drying meat drifted clean and strong. One of the elders leaned closer, rubbed a strip between his fingers, and nodded. "No flies," he said. "No spoil." Keme knelt beside them and explained his steps. How the cold water preserved what fire could not. How the earth and stone could dry meat slowly without turning it bitter. How the air mattered still, shaded, and respectful. He didn't lecture. He didn't boast. He told it like a memory being shared. The elders asked deeper questions about timing, moisture, even mold. One of them asked how to teach children without making them afraid of mistakes. "You let them fail near the fire," Keme said, "where they can still be watched. Still be guided." The oldest elder, the one who once said no boy could know more than snow, looked at him and said, "This is not a trick. This is a turning." And in that moment, Keme understood. This was no longer just a method. It was becoming law. Not written on stone, but carried in voice, in practice, in meals that lasted into moons that once starved families. That evening, the elders helped lift the drying racks not to inspect, but to assist. Their hands, slow but steady, adjusted the bark. They offered nothing but silence, and in that silence, something changed. A generation turned to face the next, not with resistance, but with pretension, respect. And under the soft light of dusk, as fire flickered low and the last deer strip dried without rot, the camp understood. This wasn't about meat anymore. It was about memory, becoming survival. They buried it beneath a pine tree at the camp's edge, not the meat itself, but the method, or at least the memory of it. Wrapped in birch bark, sealed with resin, and tied with sinew, the bundle held thin slices of perfectly dried venison, a drawing etched in charcoal on a flat stone, and a short tale carved into softened wood, not in full words, but in symbols: water, fire, hand, sun, and deer. A child could understand it. A traveler could decode it. It was meant to last. Keme called it the whisper that doesn't rot. He didn't know if it would ever be found, maybe by another tribe, maybe by a hungry scout, maybe moons or centuries from now. But he knew that one day, someone might need to remember what the earth had once taught him when failure tasted like rot, and redemption smelled like smoke-free meat. The elders blessed it. The children watched. Pana laid the final stone over the bundle with careful hands. "This way," the boy said. "It won't be forgotten." Keme smiled. By now, the entire village used the method. Some still submerged their winter kills in the lake's deep chill, but most preferred the slow dry over warm stones in spring. No one questioned it anymore. It wasn't new. It was tradition. A way of listening to the land instead of trying to conquer it, of preserving not just food, but dignity. Sometimes, travelers came asking to trade. Not for meat, but for the knowledge of how it didn't spoil. They brought beads, woven cloth, even iron. But Keme never asked for payment. "You cannot sell what the lake gave for free," he'd say. When asked why it worked so well, his answer never changed. Because the sun forgets, the fire devours, but cold water remembers. And so the teaching continued quietly, season after season, until one spring Keme's drying rack stood empty, not because he had failed, but because he was gone. The morning after his passing, the villagers found his final bundle, not for food, but for them, wrapped in bark, tied neatly, placed beside the lodge fire. Inside, a strip of perfectly dried meat, and a note carved in his hand. "I listened, so must you." They did. And long after the names faded and the old paths overgrew with moss, one thing remained: the knowledge of how to keep meat fresh for 2 moons straight, without fire, without salt, without waste. Just earth, water, air, and reverence.